Hello, today is Monday, February 17th, which is also President's Day. Welcome to episode 415 of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. I'm NSI Advisory Board member Lester Munson, and I'm joined today by NSI Senior Fellows Amy Mitchell and Andrew Boreen, and also NSI Fellow Jessica Jones. Today we're going to talk about the negotiations that are about to begin over the future of Ukraine. Of course, Russia invaded Ukraine 3 years ago. This is the third time Russia has invaded Ukraine in the last 11 years, by my count, twice in 2014, once in 2022. We're now 3 years into this war, hundreds of thousands of casualties, massive damage on both sides. The number of Russians killed or injured is staggering. The trauma on the Ukrainians is deep and profound. President Trump, of course, came into office talking about ending the war on his first day. That has not quite happened, but he is pushing for talks. Those appear to be beginning this week in Saudi Arabia. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio is on his way there to begin talks with Russian officials. Unclear whether the Ukrainians will be there or not. One of the issues that has been discussed is whether the Ukrainians will play a role in these discussions. President Zelensky has said he won't agree to anything that he's not involved in. President Trump has said he would be involved in the negotiations. But of course, the details matter: who is sitting at the table, when and why, and what will their role be. There's also been different kinds of statements from American officials. Vice President J.D. Vance, not known as a hawk on Ukraine, said that the U.S. would consider military action against Russia if it did not come to the table for a real solution on the Ukraine war. There is a special envoy for President Trump named Keith Kellogg, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor in the first administration. He has not been heard from much. It appears that Steve Witkoff, who is thought of as the Middle East envoy, is more involved with these talks. Of course, they're happening in Saudi Arabia. Andrew, I want to go to you first here. You're a Democrat. You're a veteran.
I'm not. I'm an independent. I'm a former Democrat.
All right, start over. Andrew, I'm going to go to you first. You're an independent. You're a veteran. You've been to Ukraine. You've seen the effects of this war directly. What are your thoughts about this situation?
So I think that based on what I have heard from Ukrainians of all stripes, from people on the street up to senior leadership, not including President Zelensky, because I have not had meetings with him. I'm not that important. But it has been that Ukrainians want to find a negotiated settlement that establishes hard borders and provides them long-term security and European participation. Now, the challenge is that they have felt Putin has not been tired enough. Right. And it has put President Zelensky in a very tough spot because President Zelensky can't openly start talking about negotiating, or it shows weakness to the Russians and the Russians will push further into Ukraine. That is the assessment top to bottom, what people will say not in front of President Zelensky. Right. And I think you have another factor here in that President Trump does have a relationship with Vladimir Putin. And so right now, personally, my assessment is this might not be a bad thing. If Vladimir Putin is in fact getting tired enough, if more than 500,000 Russians killed on the battlefield, North Korean infantry being killed on the battlefield, who knows what other parts of the axis of evil start sending troops to die in the Donbass or Kursk, right? And so maybe Vladimir Putin is now getting tired enough where a face-saving negotiation is appealing to him. And I would also add the context of Crimea. At the end of World War II, Yalta was chosen as the site for the Big Three negotiations between Churchill, Stalin, and FDR, right? Because the Big Three powers, and it didn't include all of Europe, even though all of Europe had a stake. And Crimea was geopolitically important because multiple wars have been fought over that port, and the Russians need it for South warm water access. So a lot happening here, but I'm cautiously optimistic that this kicks off some movement toward peace in Ukraine, or for Ukraine.
Amy, I sense that we may have a fault line here. What are your thoughts about the beginning of these negotiations?
Well, I love how President Trump just keeps coming out and kind of repeating over and over again, I want peace. Everyone wants peace. Well, yeah, everyone does want peace, but you can't just get peace by waving a magic wand. And I think it's disingenuous to not have President Zelensky at the table. This is the invasion of a sovereign country that we're talking about. Millions of lives have been lost on, combined both sides. And at the end of the day, if we give Putin whatever he kind of asked for, right, what's to stop him from doing this again when Trump's not in office in, 3.5 years? So I think, Russia has made no bones of not showing kind of their cards. If you go back to the Sochi Olympics in 2014 and the opening ceremony, there was that big display of Russian greatness, and from the rise of the Soviet Union to today, that is Putin's ultimate goal, and no one's going to hold him accountable. And if the United States doesn't, what does that say to our adversaries, or other adversaries, I should say, around the world? So, is this just kind of carte blanche, do what you want, and then we'll negotiate quote unquote peace?
Jones, our European friends have declared an emergency meeting in Paris today. I think we should probably all go out there and keep an eye on them. But what are your thoughts about whether this meeting is relevant to the little schism that we have between Andrew and Amy here?
I mean, I think that's the goal of the emergency summit, is to make the Europeans relevant, right? As of now, they don't have a seat at the table. Keith Kellogg made clear that they're not going to be involved in the talks, though we haven't heard much from him. That's one of the things he did say. And so the Europeans obviously have an interest, and they don't feel like they're being heard. So I think they're going to try to jam their way to the table, right? And so they're meeting one day before, obviously, the Saudi summit. And we've heard UK's there, the head of NATO, Poland, France, obviously, the head of the EU. And you already hear statements from the UK and France saying that they're willing to send troops to be stationed in Ukraine to serve as, guarantees of security. So that's not just money, and that's just not material, right? That's actually people on the ground in Ukraine. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm interested to see what that position means for the conversations that are going on between the US and Russia. I mean, what is Russia going to respond to? Are they going to allow that? Because I think that gives a good insight into what they see as the future of the continent and what they're planning to do. And so if the Europeans actually come out front, both in the short term about what conditions of peace look like in Ukraine, but also long term, the continent might actually step up, the defenses for themselves, and see both for this administration and the next future administrations that they're going to have to do more, that the U.S. might reduce its commitment and responsibilities abroad. So I think it's just going to be interesting to see how these two summits, how they play out. And then I think, to Amy's larger point, what this means for our adversaries in China. If the U.S. supports the deal, that looks like a win for Russia. What does that mean for our commitments in the Indo-Pacific?
Well, let me kind of jump into the fault line here, and I'm basically going to take Andrew's side. I think it's good to be having these negotiations. I think credit to President Trump for being willing to dive into this and try to come up with a solution to a war that otherwise I don't think has an endpoint that's at all sustainable. It's unrealistic to think the Ukrainians are going to militarily defeat Russia. It's simply implausible from the drop. Russia wins wars of attrition. That is its essential national character. We're not going to change that no matter what weapons. And I think we should give the Ukrainians good, effective weapons. But no matter what we give them, they're going to lose a war of attrition with Russia. So some sort of settlement is going to happen. Having said that, I worry about the credibility of the administration. They've been all over the place with different kinds of statements from different leaders. It's unclear who the actual negotiators are. It's unclear who's empowered to make what kind of statements. It seems like at the end of the day, things President Trump says at the Daytona 500 are more dispositive than anything people may say at the negotiating table. So I worry a little bit about where this will all end up and how much credibility he'll have with Vladimir Putin, who he does have a relationship with. I'm not sure it's a particularly good one at the end of the day. He keeps trying to legitimize Putin because that's kind of a free thing in Trump's mind. I'm not sure how interested Putin actually is in that, or how much anyone else will go along with it, or how seriously anyone's taking it for that matter. Okay, anyone have any final thoughts here before we close out? Andrew, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think we need to look at this in a much bigger context than just Crimea or just Ukraine. And if you look at since 1945 and since NATO's establishment later in the 1940s, we now have 32 NATO members. In the last year, we've added Sweden and Finland. And as an American Swede, I love this. However, forget Vladimir Putin. If you are a Russian human being and you are fed a steady stream of propaganda, this terrifies you. You are seeing a nuclear umbrella collective defense push further and further toward your border. to include Poland, which again, as an American, I'm all for. As an American Swede, Norwegian, Dane, I'm 100% for all of these things. I love this. However, Ukraine is not part of NATO. And so my 2 cents is, if Ukraine can secure the presence of British troops, of German Taurus missiles, and God bless you, Europe, send your technology. It's better and more lethal. If the Germans won't send Taurus missiles, why are they complaining about negotiations in Saudi? Right? And so that's kind of where I put this in context. This is a much bigger, decades-long picture. It's not just the past 2 years.
And
Amy, you get the last word.
I would just change less that, you mentioned that this is a war of attrition. I think it's actually a war of concessions. And if we don't have any respect for sovereignty, I think, to Andrew's point, this is a much larger problem that we're looking at long term.
All right, that's a wrap. Thanks so much to Kelly Crowley, Claude Jennings, and the NSI staff for their help in producing today's episode. Join us on Wednesday, February 19th, for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debate shaking up America. We are now on YouTube. Check out our channel for a video of today's episode. If you like what you heard or saw, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.